And she deals with that here. She deals with the grace of it. So I have this for you to use if you wish some other time, but I'd like to read it and just have you let it wash over you. Okay? To be deprived of the power of domination, to have little or no access to bullying power, to be unable to compel or persuade by threat or use of institutional sanctions, is necessarily to be thrown back upon other resources. And that may well be to discover that divine power, the power of grace, is of a very different kind. Effective inasmuch as it empowers and liberates human freedom. Freedom for self-transcendence, freedom for true community with others, freedom for God and for God's purposes in creation and history. On the other hand, to have access to bullying power is inevitably to be sorely tempted to use it. But it is not Christ's way. Because of our church organization, Christ's way of empowerment of human freedom to transcend is likely to be more immediately apparent to women. Looked at positively, the characteristic possibilities for a spirituality of Christian women that can really make a Christian difference in a troubled world seem to be concerned particularly with prayer, compassion, solidarity, and creative imagination. And now might we have the people on this side be the leaders and the people on this side be the responders to this little litany. Gracious God, you speak truth to the heart. Strengthen us to speak truth from the heart to one another. You have entrusted the world to our justice and compassion. Inspire us to act with courage and imagination. You have faithfully accompanied us on our life journey. Stay with us into the future and forever. And as our closing little hymn to this, the closing of the opening, we have a little excerpt from Psalm 45. And you will notice it's done in both English and Spanish. And it's just such a lovely little harkano daughter. It seems to be so appropriate for us. So even though those of you who are not Spanish speakers may not understand everything, I have just the little mantra here for you to follow. Oh.
I
for me when I call you? Okay. All right, folks. Are you okay?
And how are you for the lights? Do you want them dim?
No, we're not going to do the PowerPoint just yet.
Okay, so
But
you'll
when we
have
do
lights.
it, we'll have the lights
Okay.
turned on, if you please. Okay. We'll start then our reflection on Martha and Mary. But I wanted to ask, are you okay? Do you need to stand up, sit down, or are you okay? Comfortable? All right. So, once again today, we'll hold up a different lens to two disciples of Jesus who are extremely significant persons in his personal and ministerial life. That is, his friends Martha and Mary. And once again, I'm indebted to the work of Barbara Reed, who has a biblical scholar who has spent almost her whole professional life, excuse me, please, working on the Gospel of Luke. So it's her work that we're using, basically. Now, though Martha and Mary appear in the Gospel of John as the sisters of Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead, the passage about the two sisters that engages most people, especially women, is the passage from Luke 10:38 to 42. And Barb will come and read it for us. Now I have the copy right here. It's right here.
Luke 10:38 through 42. As they continued their journey, he entered a village where a woman whose name was Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat beside the Lord at his feet, listening to him speak. And Martha, burdened with much serving, came to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving? Tell her to help me." The Lord said to her in reply, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing, and Mary has chosen the better part, and it shall not be taken from her."
Thank you. Now, one of the things that we will notice, and maybe you've already noticed it, is that as we explore the gospel, the idea that many of us had, that the Gospels are the work of simple men, giving us quite a straightforward account of the life of Jesus, is not exactly correct. The Gospels are literary works of considerable sophistication, and they're written with specific communities of believers in mind, and they sometimes borrow material from each other, and they sometimes get the material from other resources, and sometimes they use the same story with slight modifications to emphasize different things. And I'd like to give you an example of that because I think it's just fascinating. Take, for example, the story we looked at last session, remember? I'm so sorry, I've got lots of frogs today. But anyway, this was the woman in Luke 7, often incorrectly identified with Mary Magdalene, who was a public sinner and who anointed Jesus with ointment, washed his feet with her tears, and dried them with her hair. Luke uses this account as an opportunity for Jesus to critique the judgmental Pharisee who was finding fault. You know, if he were a prophet, he surely would know what kind of person this was, and he would be engaged with her. And also, Luke wants to reveal the mercy that Jesus always shows to repentant sinners. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, a woman of the village enters the house of Simon the leper, where Jesus is dining, and she anoints Jesus' head with an alabaster jar of ointment. And once again, the woman is criticized, but not this time as a sinner, but rather for being too extravagant, using an expensive item on Jesus. After all, who would want to give anything to Jesus, you know, when it could have been sold and the money given to the poor. And here, Jesus defends the woman's action as anointing his body ahead of time for burial. It also could be an echo in the Old Testament of the anointing of the head of David as the true king, and that Jesus is the real king of Israel, and so there is a kind of a type and figure here for that. And finally, in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, Martha and Mary give a dinner in honor of Jesus after the raising of Lazarus. And Mary brings in a costly jar of ointment. She anoints his feet and dries them with her hair. And this time it's Judas who takes exception and indicates how much money this could have made if it had been sold and the price given to the poor. And John tells us that this was a fakey complaint because Judas had no concern for the poor, but he was in charge of the purse for the disciples, and he would help himself to it whenever it occurred to him that he would like something. So, but there is no reference here to Mary as of Bethany being a sinner, but once again, Jesus describes this anointing as preparing him for death. Okay, so we see how the evangelists sometimes use the same story with little variations in their accounts and use them for different purposes. Now, though the Gospels are perhaps our most precious resource for understanding Jesus, it's important to realize that their human authors sometimes reflect the tensions and struggles of the early church as it was striving to arrive at the truth of who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. And then with more and more research and study and prayer, new insights about the message of the gospel emerge. So, let's go back to Martha and Mary. For decades and decades, I think you'll recognize this, maybe even centuries, believers have been taught that in this Martha-Mary passage from Luke, Luke was using the different choices of the two sisters, the one to provide hospitality and the other to sit at his feet in rapt attention, as symbols of the two ways of the spiritual life. The life of active service, Martha, and the life of contemplation, Mary's way. And clearly, according to this interpretation, Mary's way is favored. She has chosen the better part. The thought was that Jesus was telling us that action on behalf of the gospel always has to be grounded in contemplation and prayer. We don't argue with that, but the position of being seated at the feet of the master to receive instructions is the traditional place of the disciple. Much as Paul, remember when we read about him, he was seated at the feet of Gamaliel and received his instructions in Judaism from him. So Mary's choice and Jesus' defense of her affirmed her discipleship. And it also was said to affirm that Jesus favored entrusting women with knowledge and with education, in contrast to the Jewish custom that denied education to women as inappropriate to their calling. Now, lest we condemn Jewish practice for this, we need to remember this wasn't always the case. There were some Jewish officials who definitely were advocates for women's education. And also, in our own history, some of the fathers of the church and other Christian leaders were adamant that women need not, indeed should not, receive any education beyond homemaking. So this is deep in the tradition, okay? But to return to the text, other scholars later disputed that this interpretation of Mary's choice was really what Luke wanted to tell us. Okay. They pointed out that you have to look at this passage in the context of the whole gospel. And the passage just before this is the passage of the Good Samaritan. And this is a passage of a story of someone who really acted and who looked at a need and took care of it and cared for a person with a great deal of love and concern. And so the sense was that the seeming rebuke of Jesus to Martha was just intended to kind of comfort her and tell her not to fret, and maybe to call to her attention the fact that she was a little bit too self-focused at this moment. Okay, now, this interpretation is a little gratuitous, you know, and it really gets Jesus off the hook. It kind of explains away the challenges of the text. Clearly, Jesus pitted Martha and Mary against each other, and he favored Mary. We need to say it, we need to own it. There it is in black and white in the scriptures. Now, let's look at it. No one would argue that service of others needs to flow out of our relationship with God and our sense of the gospel and our call to reach out to others in love. The motto of my order, the Dominican order, is contemplata alias tradere, and that just means to contemplate, to pray, to open oneself to God, and then give to others the fruits of that, to reach out and invite others into God's loving embrace. Okay, so that's okay. But doesn't it seem odd that Jesus chose to respond this strange way to the two sisters, really favoring one over the other? In her book, Choosing the Better Part, Barbara Reed asks a whole series of questions that I suspect many of us have found ourselves asking from time to time. She says, why, if the Christian ideal is to integrate contemplation and action, seeing the value of both, why then are the two cast over against each other in this text, as one clearly better than the other? Why in a gospel where serving epitomizes the very mission of Jesus, why does he reprimand Martha for serving? And why is hearing the word valued in this text when all through the gospel there is constant reference that discipleship consists not only in hearing, but in acting, in doing loving service for others? And why, if Mary is so good at listening, doesn't she hear the stress of her sister and help her? And why doesn't Jesus, who's so compassionate toward those who feel downtrodden, sympathize with Martha? We have to own that this kind of behavior is utterly uncharacteristic of Jesus, kind of setting up a division between the two sisters. And so Barbara Reed eventually asks, is this a true representation from the life of the historical Jesus? Or does it rather reflect, as we suggested earlier, a tension in Luke's community about the role of women? Let's look at it in a little more depth. Well, first of all, let's acknowledge this text doesn't do much to draw women like ourselves, who always have more to do than we have hours in the day, to a Jesus who seems pretty indifferent to our daily struggles. And who even finds fault with somebody who's working very hard to make things nice for him. You know, he doesn't seem very grateful. There are no women among my friends who would ever describe themselves in any other way but as a Martha. Think about it. Have you ever heard anybody say, oh, I'm Mary? Good for you! Most women.
My sister is Martha.
Your sister? Okay. Good, we want to hear about that. But anyway, many women will say things like, well, I'm a Martha. You know, I don't have time to sit at Jesus' feet. It would be very nice, but I just can't do it. I just can't do it. So what can help us understand this text? Well, I think by acknowledging that there is a very good possibility that in Luke's day, in Luke's community, there was a real struggle over what ministerial roles could legitimately be carried out by women. I'm wondering if this sounds familiar to anybody. If you look at other translations of the passage that Barb read, many of the translations that are more recent, my own New Revised Standard Version says, it doesn't stop with Martha, welcome Jesus. It says, Martha welcomed Jesus into her house. Okay. At this time, there were house churches beginning to be established in the Christian community. People still went to pray in the synagogues, but they got together in people's homes. The very first house church we know was Peter's house in Capernaum, where Jesus made his home during his public life. But in Bethany, we're quite sure it was Martha's house. And this suggests that Martha was not simply a friendly, hospitable woman, which of course she was, but that her home was a house church, and she held a position of ecclesial leadership within it. Now let's look at Paul, who was the earliest writer of the New Testament. We know from Paul that in his time, many, many women were involved in a wide variety of ministries, including leadership, apostolic work, and preaching. If you look at his letter to the Romans, Paul mentions Phoebe, who led the church at Cenchreae. He mentions Julia, a prominent woman disciple, and a whole list of others. Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, and Prisca, all female co-workers of Paul. I've always wondered why Tryphena and Tryphosa's mothers and fathers named them those names. Nevertheless, that's their name. But it's clear from various clues in the text that the early church was not of one mind about the appropriateness of these ministries being exercised by women. And really, that's not so different today, is it? You look at some dioceses where bishops really embrace the ministry of women very willingly, and others who are much more hesitant. Even parishes where pastors are progressive, they want women to be more participative, and others just they're not anxious for that to happen. So, in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, I think this is so interesting. He clearly supports both men and women in praying and prophesying in the liturgical assembly. Though he says women should cover their heads when they do so, and men should be bareheaded. And we think the reason for that is that they wanted to distinguish themselves from the pagan rituals where men covered their heads and women were bareheaded. And so to make the distinction, Paul gave this directive. However, now this was in chapter 11. In chapter 14, we know that a later copyist inserted the directive that women keep silent in the churches and be subordinate as even the law says. He further insists that if women want to learn anything, they should ask their husbands at home. Now we know that this was a later addition, because if it weren't, it would make no sense. Paul would be contradicting himself 3 chapters after he has said men and women should do these acts, these rituals. So Paul championed the leadership of women in the early churches, but it's easy to see the development of resistance to this as the church became more organized and time passed. Later in the 1st century, a Christian writing in Paul's name, and we know that not every single book that's called by a certain person's name is necessarily that person, but they might be developing the theology of that individual. So in the first letter to Timothy, we hear an assertion that women not teach or have any authority over a man, and a woman who receives instruction should do so silently and under complete control. These are quotes. And women elders were to exercise a teaching ministry only among younger women. Now, see, these were not, it's such an interesting thing because poor Paul gets such a bad rap because of some of the things that were written into his letters. And there are a few places where it is difficult, where we really think Paul himself said some stuff that we can't quite figure out. But most of the time, it would seem, these were redactions of later people. This was not Paul's attitude. He really was inclusive of the ministry of women. So, contemporary scholars suggest that the same movement to silence women and consign their role to passive listening, not that listening is unimportant, but that this movement is at work in Luke's community and is manifested in this passage. And that is why Mary is so affirmed and Martha is critiqued by Jesus. Excuse me. Now we know that scholars go over these texts with more than a fine-tooth comb. If I were to go into all of the ins and outs and the nuances of the translation of Barbara Reed, of the Greek and everything, you would be dying of boredom, I'm afraid. But I want to say to you, that is there. And it's very, very credible. You know, her translation, her exploration of the meaning of the text. And we know that this passage about Martha and Mary choosing the better part, we know that it was later. Because, one of the reasons, because Martha uses the word Lord in addressing Jesus. And that didn't happen until considerably later in the public life of Jesus. It was not a greeting that was used early to refer to him. So, there are a lot of, this is just an instance of the old conflict regarding the role of women in the church. But I think it's important for us, as women in the church and women of the heart, to see what is at work in these passages and never internalize false messages which constrain our ministry or our capacity to speak and to participate in the active life of the church in the world. Any of these that suggest that we are called by Jesus into silent passivity in ecclesial circles, or in any other circles for that matter, that this is not of Jesus. This is not true. And internalizing it would be a serious mistake. Now, I just want to point out quickly that I want to contrast Luke's gospel in that particular passage with John's gospel. The fourth gospel profiles strong women characters who engage in theological discussions with Jesus. Remember the Samaritan woman, last time we talked about that. And they profess their profound faith, and they preach publicly and convincingly. Unlike the Gospel of Luke, there is no attempt to silence women in John's Gospel, or to restrict them to quiet, behind-the-scenes, homebound ministries. In John 11, Martha and Mary are featured in the story of the raising of Lazarus, their brother, from the dead. And he was in the tomb, remember, 4 days. In one of the early, more earthly translation, Martha is concerned because she says, he's been in the tomb 4 days, and by this time the body stinketh. So she's very aware, you know, that there is some kind of deterioration. We're told of the love that Jesus had for Martha. Martha's mentioned first. It says in John's Gospel, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. But when Jesus hears of Lazarus' illness, he doesn't go right away. He waits around, and it's Martha, when he's on his way, who comes out to meet him, and she complains that if he had been there a little earlier, her brother would not have died. However, she also expresses her faith that Jesus is still capable of redeeming the situation. She says, remember, but even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. And then in the dialogue which follows, I always get goose pimples when I read this. It is so beautiful. Martha again affirms her faith in the resurrection. Jesus says, your brother will rise again. She says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection of the dead. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And it's Martha who receives this magnificent revelation. And when Jesus asks her if she believes this, she responds, yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world. Now, interestingly enough, if you look back to John's initial statement about why he wrote the gospel, he says, he describes that very purpose. He says, I am writing this that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through this belief you may have life in his name. So John features Martha as the model believer. Okay. Now, though Martha is clearly the stronger character, Mary is not insignificant in the story of the raising of Lazarus. When Martha tells her that Jesus is near, she too comes out and she meets him, and she too expresses her disappointment that he didn't come sooner. And when Jesus sees Mary weeping, John tells us that Jesus himself began to weep. He was so touched and had such compassion for the loss that these two sisters endured. Later at the celebration, after Lazarus is risen, Martha serves the dinner, and Mary anoints Jesus' feet with the precious ointment. There are scholars who suggest that in this particular case with Mary's anointing, what John is doing here is foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do 2 chapters later when he washes the feet of his disciples in that very, very tender pericope. So, both figures are important. Martha is the stronger character, and both contemplation and action are important. They are not enemies of each other. They complement each other. And it's evident that the Johannine communities interpreted Jesus' words and deeds very differently from Luke. They understand Jesus to commission all Christians, women as well as men, to express their faith in the performance of all manner of ministries. And so, as we conclude, we see again that holding up a different lens reveals something quite different. It reveals something quite different about Martha and Mary, and about ourselves, our own call, and about Jesus, who was their closest friend, and who is also our closest friend. So, all right, that's my reflection for this morning.